We begin with Stephen Downes, Professor of Music at Royal Holloway, University of London, who is a very prolific author of monographs, articles about 19th, 20th century music in Europe, particularly Mid Europe, Northern German and East European music. And he has received a lot of prizes and grants. And what I quote only a couple of titles, these books: The Muse and Eros, Erotic Fantasy and Male Creativity, Romantic Modern Imagination, or Music and Sentimentalism in the 19th century, 20th century music. In this, he is preparing his third monographs on Szymanowski, and is published also a collection of writings about the construction of Polish musical identity outside Poland. And in this case, we have a real case of a hybrid identity, a Polish composer born and grew up in Ukraine. Thank you very much. Very curious.
Thank you for your introduction. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Good. Interviewed on his 50th birthday in 1932, the composer Karol Szymanowski remarked, "I was born and raised in Ukraine. I felt it deeply in my heart. I liked its genial climate, its tempestuousness and sweetness." In this paper, I will begin by considering the significance of the cultural environment of Szymanowski's upbringing in Ukraine, and then move to consider Ukraine's symbolic status, and especially that of the steppe, Odessa, and the Black Sea coast, in his work with his cousin, the poet Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz, on the opera King Roger. Szymanowski was born into a noble Polish family which traced its ancestors back to the 16th century and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. His birthplace was the family estate at Tymoshówka. He was born on October the 3rd, 1882, but spent his very early childhood in Ołowa Bałka. The family moved to the Tymoshówka manor house in 1889, and Szymanowski lived there as a subject of Tsar Nicholas II until the Bolsheviks arrived in autumn 1917. He received his earliest musical education first at home. The manor house had a rich library and 2 Bechstein pianos, and then at the Neuhaus Music School in Elisabethgrad, where the family had a town house. So this is Gustav Neuhaus, then there's Szymanowski with the moustache, his sister, Neuhaus again, and then in the far corner is Szymanowski's father. He was influenced by the Wagnerian Neuhaus, who was a distant relation, and became a close friend with Heinrich Neuhaus, who was just a few years younger than Szymanowski and would become a famous pianist during the Soviet era. Szymanowski recalled that though Tymoshówka was a rural village and the town of Elisabethgrad felt remote and small, he was surrounded by cultural activity. His father, Stanisław, was a highly cultured man with interests in contemporary artistic trends, as well as a respect for history. These intellectual interests were reflected in the collection of paintings and books held in the manor house. At home, French was widely spoken, German culture revered, philosophy as well as music, Russian literature and music admired, for Karol especially early Scriabin, and of course Chopin was held close to the heart. But we must avoid idealizing. Szymanowski's father was a fierce Polish patriot who would not entertain Russians. Only when he died in 1905 did the Szymanowskis develop a strong relationship with the Davidovs, a highly cultured Russian family who lived just 7 kilometers away. The Szymanowski homeland was an ethnic mix of Tatars, Cossacks, Jews, Russians, Ukrainians, as well as Poles. That's a map of 1919. The Poles call this region Kresy, the eastern borderlands, which can also mean edge. It's a term now little used, but from the mid-19th century it was commonplace in the language of the Polish-Lithuanian nobility. Its Russian parallel is Ukrainian. It's a far from neutral term, but one imbued with nationalist discourse and nostalgia for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It also reinforced a regional position of marginalisation, even if it brings boundaries into question. These borderlands are a contested, ambiguous place. Both the concept of a borderland location and the cosmopolitan outlook of Szymanowski's family, the possibility that one can exemplify multiple ways of belonging all at once, combined to form a launchpad for his musical fantasies of space and place, his evocations of distance and nearness, belonging and identity, self and other. These early experiences in Ukraine encouraged Szymanowski to develop a fantastical escape to places beyond home, while also keeping close the strong sense of belonging to the location of his upbringing. For Szymanowski, Ukraine was both intimate and capacious. Szymanowski constructed an imaginary geography of Poland and its neighbours, Ukraine, Russia, Germany, I'm using quotation marks purposefully, and then looked beyond in a project of modernist expansionism through privileges of travel and imaginative fantasies. As we shall see, in these spatial and historical imaginings, Szymanowski developed a perspectivism that queried notions of centre and periphery, relatedness and difference. Binaries of self-other and hegemony resistance were partially rethought through processes of appropriation, translation, and double identity. I say partially because the colonial outlook of the Orientalist Polish noble always remains at play. The most transformative of Szymanowski's journeys away from Ukraine were those to Sicily. Of the first, in late spring of 1911, and especially Termina, he wrote, "It's marvellous here. You have no idea what a huge impression these ruins make. I'm in a constant state of rapture." Harry Neuhaus noticed a significant change in Szymanowski when he returned from these travels. A second trip in spring 1914, which would turn out to be his last, confirmed that Sicily encapsulated his artistic dreams and values. After this second visit, his friend Arthur Rubinstein recalled that Szymanowski raved about Sicily, especially Termina. There, Szymanowski said, I saw a few young men bathing who could be models for emptiness. I couldn't take my eyes off them. Now he was a confirmed homosexual, Szymanowski told me all of this with burning eyes. End of quote. So, for Szymanowski, Sicily became a liminal space of erotic transgression and also one of self-fulfillment and self-definition. During the First World War, unable to travel outside Ukraine, Szymanowski yearned to return to the beautiful, erotically charged Sicily. On viewing photographic souvenirs of his Italian journeys while stuck in Timoshovka, he wrote to his travelling companion Stefan Spies, "Perhaps we could travel, if only to Crimea. I have the feeling that if we were to see the sea, the mountains, and if only a few cypresses and olive trees, then we should feel somewhat better." But with the approach of the Bolsheviks in the autumn of 1917, the Szymanowskis were forced to abandon their Timoshovka estate and move to the relative safety of their townhouse in Elizabethgrad. From his forced entrapment in June 1918, Szymanowski described the charms of Sicily to his cousin Iwaszkiewicz, who had never visited the island and indeed then only knew the steppes and fields of Ukraine. Iwaszkiewicz was born in Kalnik in 1894. The little boy is Iwaszkiewicz in the middle. And like Szymanowski, was schooled in Elizabethgrad. By 1918, he was established as one of Poland's most talented young poets. Szymanowski's description of Sicily clearly made a deep impression on Iwaszkiewicz. Recalling those conversations, he explicitly linked Sicily with the landscape of Ukraine. The wheat and hot fields of Ukraine, he wrote, probably reminded Szymanowski of Sicilian fields, because, after all, Ukraine is like a failed Sicily. In the same way, cultures here clashed and piled up, leaving behind, however, not magnificent glorious monuments, but only subterranean currents, roots of cut trunks, which constitute the main cultural charm of this country. When he says failed, that's probably not a great translation. He means that it's been reduced to rubble, by comparison with the fact that in Sicily you can still see all that remains. In a description of the scenery on a train journey he took from Elizabethgrad to Kiev later that month, Iwaszkiewicz continued to develop symbolic links between the Ukrainian landscape and Sicily. He recalled, looking at this landscape, to which I knew I was bidding farewell, and drawing the aroma of the steppes and fields into my nostrils, the aroma of my youth, I went over everything in my mind that I had talked about with Karol in Elizabethgrad. Both here, Ukraine, and there, Sicily, layers of culture of the East and West have been superimposed one on top of the other, creating a specific aura. Except that here, Ukraine, the traces of these cultures have disappeared from the face of the earth, swept away by the cataclysms of history, while in Sicily they have existed alongside each other, and one need only to reach out their hand for them. They surround the traveller on all sides. So Szymanowski and Iwaszkiewicz were adding a Sicilian layer to the symbolic multiplicity of the Ukrainian steppe. In so doing, they were contributing to the complex, shifting symbolic status of the Ukrainian landscape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For Poles, for Józef Helmonski's canvas, which you can see there, and Zygmunt Noskowski's symphonic poem Steppe are symbolic equivalents. Noskowski taught Szymanowski in Warsaw. His symphonic poem, Steppe, was headed with an epigram, which you have on the screen. O wondrous steppe, with song I greet you. Amongst thy vast expanses, the noise of the cavalry's wings and the beat of horses' hoofs could once be heard, the shepherd's pipe and the wistful song of the Cossacks, accompanied by the torban and the drum, by battle cries and the clatter of clashing sabres. But these gigantic struggles and combats are now over, and the warriors lie in their graves. Only you remain, O immense steppe of eternal beauty and calm. The key image and recurring image, as we all see, is that the steppe is an upper layer covering subterranean relics. So the steppe is therefore a contested, multi-layered, symbolic borderland space, and for that very reason, attractive, stimulating, inspiring. In Kiev, during the summer of 1918, inspired by the imaginary confluence of Ukraine and Sicily, Iwaszkiewicz wrote a Sicilian sketch, the first outland scenario of what would become the opera King Roger, set in 12th century Norman-ruled Sicily. Szymanowski was very enthusiastic. In September and October 1918, Szymanowski stayed at the Davidov summer villa in Odessa. Iwaszkiewicz joined him there. As they developed their ideas for King Roger, they identified the Ukrainian Black Sea coast with Sicily. Szymanowski wrote to Mariana Davidov of how the splendid Black Sea filled me with an infinite yearning for the true landscapes of my dreams on the distant shores of the real South. I should like to show you as an example of my landscape the sea at Taormina, and not just for its external beauty, but for its deep and intimate significance, for all those splendid ghosts which still hover there. Iwaszkiewicz recalls his stay with Szymanowski at Odessa and the inspirational link between the Ukrainian and Sicilian coasts. He wrote, I was seeing the sea for the first time, It appeared to me as half sapphire, half green and swollen high. A breeze was coming over it from the south, like the revelation of unknown lands, the same breeze which had ruffled King Roger's cloak. Here, right by the shore of this sea, our drama became crystallized. As Szymanowski and Ivaschkevich drew up their opera in Odessa, in their imagination, Sicilian space overlapped with Ukrainian space. The images and symbolisms of their landscapes converged. Their understanding of identity was developed by a superimposition of the Ukrainian home space and a Mediterranean other. Odessa and Sicily were ripe for this creative confluence. The Italian influence in Odessa had been strong since its foundation by expats in 1794. The city, as both an edge and a crossroads, rapidly became symbolic of cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic hybridity. This reputation was intensified in the early years of the century before the Bolsheviks took over. And Sicily was no random other location. The Sicilian myth synthesized the east-west polarities of Europe. Szymanowski and Ivaschkevich thereby created a double landscape, a reinvention of the Ukrainian landscape in another setting, inspired by the perceived shared characteristics of the steppe, the Black Sea coast, and ancient Sicily as borderlands. Sicilian surface features are manifestations of what lies buried under the Ukrainian steppe. In short, through the identification with Sicily, Szymanowski and Ivaschkevich created a new cultural metaphor for Ukraine as a liminal sphere, layered as a palimpsest through a process of polyglot overwriting. And again, one should acknowledge the colonial discourse at play as a mythologized, aestheticized, Italianized Arcadian Ukraine is seen through the eyes of sons of Polish landowners. The dramatic content of King Roger is quickly summarized. In the magnificent cathedral of Palermo, Roger hears of the disturbing arrival from unknown eastern lands of a strangely beautiful shepherd, who is an ambiguous character, part Christ, part Dionysus. This shepherd's religion of pagan erotic love is a challenge to the rule of law and church, so Roger seeks to imprison him. Roger's consort, Queen Roxana, has fallen under the shepherd's spell, and she and the shepherd lead an orgiastic oriental dance. Finally, with dawn approaching, the shepherd's identity as Dionysus is revealed, and he leads his Maenad followers into the darkness. Roger is left alone with his Arabian sage, Edrisi, greeting the sun as it rises across the seas in the east. Through the encounter, Roger has been transformed into a new, more complete man. His psychological transformation is presented through geographical symbolism. He acts 3 locations, but each are layers within Sicily. First, Byzantine, the Orthodox cathedral. Second, the Far East, the Oriental dance. And finally, in the third act, the Greco-Roman, a ruined amphitheatre. In Szymanowski and Ivaschkevich's imaginations, this threefold identity, therefore, also applies to Ukraine: Byzantine, Hellenic, Eastern. In the opera, each of these locations are given a voice. In the last act, these supposedly distant voices are heard within Roger's mind. The scene setting for Caspar Holton's 2015 Royal Opera House production in London presented layers within a massive head. The upper layer, which contains a globe and a library, is rational knowledge. In the lower levels, bodies writhe in erotic abandon. In Act 1, the head faces the audience, so we cannot see these layers. In Act 2, it is turned so we can see the 3 layers inside. This is Act 2, which are perhaps, I think, obviously id, ego, and superego. And in Act 3, there is no head, only rubble, the ruins of the head from a bonfire. The head has strata in a kind of psychological geology. In the end, these layers collapse in a manner we might compare with the Ukrainian steppe. At the end of the opera, only the sage Edrisi, symbol of knowledge, stands by his king. Edrisi is an historical figure, most famous for his tabula Roger of 1154, a map of Sicilian's known world in the late 12th century. This is upside down, by the way. Edrisi put north at the bottom and south at the top. So I flipped it so that it's conventional with north at the top. But you can see where we are. Here is Sicily. Here's the Black Sea, rather squashed. So this is a representation of the Sicilian known world at this time. What we are presented with here is just as landscapes can be read as palimpsests, as stratified layers of symbolic text, so maps can be read as poetic constructions. Idrisi's map is much as map of the mind as it is as a map of land. Sorry, this is me being peculiar. It even looks a bit like a brain to me. We are presented with an affective or psychological geography in which spaces and distances may be magnified or collapsed. Places may move closer or become more divided, changing what is central and what is marginal, what is home and what is remote. Roger is a subject positioned within an effectively and imaginatively redrawn geography in which Ukraine is in one sense nowhere. It is never explicitly mentioned in the opera, but in another sense is everywhere. I will close with a poem which Iwaszkiewicz wrote for Szymanowski and was published in a leading Polish music journal in late 1929. So this obviously was in Polish, but we have it in English and Ukrainian. Thank you for sorting that out, Rutger. I have no Ukrainian. I'll read the English. We spoke, flushed with light and pensive thoughts, the king of distant Sicily, the unknown Roger, in mixing eastern gold with evening silver, plays as fragrant Palermo's vesper bell, a summons to sacrifice more terrible than all, which would in the Bacchae's uniting call reveal the true God to ourselves. Hear these whispers, which play within us so. Is it not the rustling of corn, wide as the sea? Is it not the breath of night, which has woven your coat from the choicest perfumes of the steppes, from wormwood and musk? Is it not the playing of a most beautiful land, which yielded us, like it bore thousands of red evenings, like the thousands of plaintive songs it had borne? It is her, Ukraine, the song of past and future. And so just so you get a sense of the sound world of the opera, because you may or may not know it, I'm hoping this will work. We have the final moments of King Roger. Mariusz Kwiecień plays the part of Roger, as he did in London, but this is the Paris production of 2009. Musically brilliant, but with a totally perverse stage direction by Warlikowski. He was roundly booed when he came onto the stage at the end of the performance. But the solo from Mariusz is terrific. So this is the very closing minute or two of King Roger. How do I click on the play? So I just press it again. Thank you.